Most people imagine World War I trenches as muddy holes in the ground, dirty, miserable, uncomfortable, and they were. But that description still misses the point, because the real horror of trench warfare was not just the violence, it was the waiting. Imagine waking up every morning already exhausted because you barely slept. Your clothes are wet again. The floor beneath you is not really a floor anymore. It is mud mixed with rat droppings, rotting wood, old food, and sometimes human remains. A year ago, you were working in a factory, delivering bread, studying in school, flirting with girls, playing football with your friends. Now you are standing knee-deep in freezing mud holding a rifle while artillery explodes somewhere beyond the fog. And the strangest part? After enough time, your brain adapts to it. That is what made trench warfare so psychologically terrifying. Human beings can normalize almost anything if they are trapped inside it long enough. By the time the First World War ended in 1918, around 20 million people were dead. But for many soldiers, the war did not feel like constant battle. It felt like surviving one long, miserable existence underground. The trenches stretched across Europe like scars carved into the earth. At their peak, there were over 400 miles of trench systems running through France and Belgium. Entire underground worlds built purely for survival, and they were never meant to be comfortable. Most trenches were only about 6 or 7 feet deep, just enough to protect soldiers from direct rifle fire. The walls were reinforced with wood, sandbags, and corrugated metal sheets, but heavy rain constantly caused collapses. Some trenches flooded so badly that soldiers had to walk in water for days. This led to something called trench foot. Your feet stayed wet and cold for so long that the tissue began to rot. The skin turned white, then blue, then black. Some soldiers lost toes. Others lost entire feet. And this was happening before combat even started. People today often imagine war as non-stop action. Gunfire, explosions, constant movement, but trench warfare was mostly boredom interrupted by moments of absolute terror. A soldier could spend weeks doing routine tasks, repairing sandbags, cleaning weapons, carrying supplies, writing letters home. Then suddenly, without warning, artillery would start falling from the sky. And artillery was the real killer of World War I, not rifles, not bayonets. Historians estimate that roughly 60% of battlefield deaths in the war came from artillery shells. Imagine hearing a distant whistle and knowing that somewhere above you, a piece of metal bigger than your arm is falling toward the earth at hundreds of miles per hour. Sometimes soldiers never even saw the enemy who killed them. That is something veterans talked about constantly after the war. The sound, shells exploding day and night, machine guns rattling in the distance, men coughing, men screaming, rain hitting helmets, boots sloshing through mud, rats scratching inside the trench walls while people tried to sleep. Your nervous system never got a break. Today, we would probably recognize many of these soldiers as severely traumatized. Back then, people called it shell shock. At first, military leaders thought shell shock was cowardice. Some soldiers became unable to speak. Others shook uncontrollably. Some froze completely during battle. Officers often assumed they were weak or pretending. But eventually, doctors realized something terrifying. The human brain simply was not designed to endure that level of stress for that long. One British soldier described feeling more afraid during silence than during combat, because silence meant something was wrong. Silence meant an attack might be coming. Think about how insane that is psychologically. Your brain becomes so used to chaos that peace itself starts feeling dangerous. And then there were the rats. Some trench rats grew as large as cats because they fed on leftover food and dead bodies. Soldiers would wake up with rats crawling across their blankets at night. Sometimes they bit sleeping men. The trenches also had lice everywhere. Soldiers constantly scratched themselves. Entire uniforms became infested. And remember, many bodies could not even be recovered safely during active fighting. Sometimes corpses remained buried in the walls of the trenches themselves. Men were eating meals a few feet away from dead soldiers. And despite all of this, people still found ways to act human. Soldiers told jokes, they played cards, they sang songs. Some made tea while artillery exploded nearby. Others decorated their sections of trench walls with tiny personal items from home. Photos, letters, drawings. Anything that reminded them the outside world still existed. That sentence says everything about human psychology. People do not just fight to survive physically. They fight to survive mentally. Even small routines become lifelines. And then there was something called going over the top. This was the moment soldiers climbed out of the trench and charged across no man's land toward enemy positions. No man's land was exactly what it sounds like. A stretch of destroyed earth between opposing trenches filled with craters, barbed wire, bodies, and mud. Imagine climbing a ladder while knowing machine guns are pointed directly at you. Sometimes entire units disappeared within minutes. During the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered around 57,000 casualties in a single day. To put that into perspective, that is more than the population of many towns completely shattered in less than 24 hours. And yet, the war continued for over 2 more years. This is where World War I becomes hard for modern people to emotionally process. The scale was simply enormous. Factories were producing death industrially. Rail systems moved soldiers like cargo. Entire nations reorganized themselves around attrition. And the soldiers trapped inside trenches often had no idea whether anything they were doing was even working. Sometimes they gained a few hundred yards after thousands died, then lost those same yards a week later. That is another thing trench warfare destroyed. The idea that war was heroic in the traditional sense. Before World War I, many people still imagined combat almost romantically. The trenches shattered that illusion permanently, because there is nothing glamorous about watching your friend slowly lose his mind from exhaustion while both of you sit in freezing water, surrounded by rats. And maybe that is why World War I changed art, literature, and culture so deeply afterward. The soldiers who came home were not the same people who left. Writers stopped describing war as beautiful. Poets stopped pretending violence was noble. An entire generation became deeply suspicious of nationalism, politics, and authority because they had seen where blind patriotism could lead. Young men who thought they were marching into adventure instead found themselves trapped in mechanized horror. Some never fully escaped it even after returning home. Years later, veterans still reacted to loud noises. Some could not sleep properly. Others rarely talked about the war at all. Not because they forgot it, because they could not. And maybe that is the part people still struggle to understand about World War I trenches. Not how soldiers died there, but how they continued living there. Because after a while, the trenches stopped feeling temporary. For many soldiers, that muddy strip of earth became their entire world. And meanwhile, somewhere far away, normal life was still happening. People were getting married. Kids were going to school. Shops were opening every morning. Trains were arriving on schedule. Entire cities kept moving while millions of young men sat trapped underground wondering if they would still be alive by sunset. That contrast is what makes World War I feel so haunting even today. Civilization on one side, industrialized suffering on the other. And between them stood ordinary people who never really had a choice. The trenches were not just battlefields. They were proof of what happens when modern technology advances faster than human wisdom. Because by 1914, humanity had learned how to build machine guns powerful enough to erase entire waves of people in seconds. But it still had not learned how to stop sending those waves. And maybe that is why the First World War still feels strangely modern. Not because of the weapons, but because the psychology behind it still exists. Fear, propaganda, division. Young people being told sacrifice will make history proud of them. Then reality arrives. By the end of the war, millions were dead, entire countries were traumatized, and Europe would never fully look the same again. But somewhere inside all of that destruction, one uncomfortable truth remained. Most of the soldiers were never trying to become heroes. They were just trying to make it to tomorrow.